Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be with you all this afternoon again. Welcome back to the 6th Annual Water Finance Conference. Andrew Clark, Managing Editor of Water Finance and Management Journal. We are the producers and organizers of the annual Water Finance Conference. If any of you attended sessions 1 and 2 last week, welcome back. Hope you were able to tune in and enjoy some of those presentations and panel discussions we had for you. So here we are with session 3, and so we're glad to have you with us again. So I'm going to keep our introductions brief today, as I have been. I first of all just want to acknowledge our main event sponsors this year, the National Association of Clean Water Agencies and Scenario. And I also want to acknowledge Xylem, which is also serving as a sponsor this year. It's always great to have such great participation from each of our sponsors every year and involvement. It's really great to have their support. They've really helped us to grow this conference over the years. I just want to take a minute to go through our format for today. We're going to be going in a similar format to what we did last week for sessions 1 and 2. We will have a approximately 25-30 minute kickoff presentation to start off, and then we will move into our panel discussion, which will be the go from 1:30 to 3. I do want to mention, if anybody has any questions throughout, we encourage you to submit questions through the questions box. If there's any questions for our two presenters here to start, and then later on during the panel, please submit those questions. I'll be monitoring that, and I will try and prompt any questions to our presenters or panelists that come in. We have had some questions about viewing PowerPoint slides. So just to be clear, you are meant to see both the PowerPoint slides for our presenters here at the start, as well as you should see video feed of them. So just make sure you minimize the green box, which you should see on your left-hand side. You can also maximize the viewing window of the PowerPoint slides, though, if you need to see those, so you can see those a little bit easier. If anybody has any questions on that, just look in the presenter chat. We're going to put some information in there if you're having any trouble with that. So without any more delay, let me go ahead and introduce our two presenters today. First off, I'll give you a little bit of background as to what we were looking for this opening presentation. Today, we wanted to cover a little bit about federal funding, or I should say funding federal and state mandates. We started off last week by talking about rate setting, affordability. We talked about revenue recovery and how a lot of new technologies in the industry are assisting with cost savings and kind of recapturing hidden revenue at water utilities. So another big issue that always tends to come out at this conference is all of the regulatory mandates that are coming down from either the federal, state level, and utilities that might be struggling to pay for some of those mandates. So we figured it would be good to have an overview of some of that, and at the same time, just also have an overview on some EPA initiatives. So we invited a couple representatives from NACWA to talk about that. So we are first going to have Emily Remmel, Director of Regulatory Affairs with National Association of Clean Water Agencies. Emily works on a variety of water quality, stormwater, and water reuse issues. She received her bachelor's and master's in zoology from the University of Oklahoma, where she focused her research on freshwater ecology and invasive species. She also earned a Juris Doctorate from Vermont Law School, as well as a certificate in water resources law. She is barred in New Hampshire and in Washington, D.C. We're also going to have Kristina Surfus, Managing Director of Government Affairs for NACWA. Prior to joining NACWA in 2015, Kristina worked on the Hill as a consultant. She earned her master's in freshwater science and policy from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and a bachelor's in environmental analysis and policy and international relations from Boston University. So Ladies, thanks for joining us. Pleasure to have you. Emily, I believe you're going to start us off. So whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. I think you guys can hear me now, and I'm just going to transition here over to my slides. Really happy to be here. Humbled for the invitation from Water Finance, and I'm glad and hope you guys are all having a good conference this year. I know things are a little different with COVID-19. For the NACWA team, it's definitely hit the 6-month date for us, where we have been working from home for the last 6 months, which has brought on a lot of challenges, as you all probably are feeling yourselves. So today, Andrew did ask me and my colleague Kristina to give some updates on what's happening at EPA, and as well as what's going on the Hill. And specifically, I picked two key issues, but I also want to address a few other regulatory initiatives that are on the horizon. And in just this last last few hours, we've had some updates of pretty massive regulatory initiatives coming down the pike. So I'm the Regulatory Affairs Director at NACWA. And if you're not familiar with NACWA, we are a national trade association. We represent public wastewater utilities and stormwater agencies across the country. We have over 330 public utilities as members. They range from very small utilities to the largest of the large utilities across the United States. And as you'll probably see from today's webinar, we do a lot of legislative advocacy. We do a great deal of regulatory advocacy with EPA, but we also have a legal component to our association. So we do occasionally get involved in some litigation. You might be familiar with the most recent Maui case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. And I'm just getting a quick note on the presenter chat that I'm not sure. Can we just confirm that the folks on the attendance side of things can see the PowerPoint? Okay, thanks. Vicky just confirmed that you guys can see both. That makes me happy. All right, so the first issue I want to talk about today is PFAS. This is something that I have been involved with for quite some time. It really gained traction at the federal level in 2018 when EPA held a summit on the issue, kind of just addressing where the agency plans to move forward with PFAS. The hard thing to wrap your head around with this suite of chemicals, which can vary between 5,000 up to, I think I've heard 8,000 different unique chemical components. So it is challenging for us in the water sector. I've included the drinking water folks in here as well. They have some unique issues that they are dealing with, but it is a challenging issue simply just because it is so complex and technical. It cross-cuts almost every single environmental statute that we have, regulations included. So everything from the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, we're seeing CERCLA become more of an issue as well. TSCA, there's just the Clean Air Act. It hits on every environmental statute that we have. So over the last 2 or 3 years, as the water sector has caught up to speed on PFAS generally, we've learned a lot. And this is a good thing. We are struggling initially with managing parts per trillion chemicals. Usually we're tasked with parts per billion. PCBs, for example, were parts per billion. Now we're dealing with parts per trillion. So our detection ability and our confidence in that data has really grown over the last couple years. And there's a lot of innovation happening around treatment capabilities. So it still is a challenging issue, but we are seeing technology play a role in how we're looking at PFAS and potentially the role that the water sector has with managing this. So just some background information. If you're not aware, EPA did put forth an action plan that laid out all of its initiatives regarding PFAS and really wanted to be transparent on what it aims to achieve in the coming years and the challenges the agency has itself with dealing with such a complex and large suite of chemicals. They did offer an update to their action plan this last February. Obviously, because of COVID-19, this PFAS, we haven't seen as much movement in the last couple of months on PFAS, but that is in no way meaning or telling that we should let our guards down in terms of advocacy. So in the action plan and in the update, I just wanted to give a few pieces of information. Under the Clean Water Act, there are pieces in the action plan that deal with pretreatment, effluent limitation guidelines. EPA is working on figuring out some analytical methods for sampling and monitoring. There's the potential, if the data exists, for future water quality criteria to be established by the agency. These are recommendations that are handed to the states for the states then to put into water quality standards and NPDES permits. So that's futuristically speaking on the horizon. We haven't heard specifically from EPA any meaty details of where they're headed or what kind of data they're using. Residual management, this has been an issue that has sort of taken the forefront, at least on the Clean Water Act side of things. We've seen a lot of trade press stories, news media stories on biosolids and the impact that biosolids on land application might have if it contains substantial PFAS concentrations. There's also been some issues with what happens when you incinerate PFAS. Where does it go? Is the temperature high enough to actually break apart the very strong bond between the chlorides and the fluorines, which is unique in and of itself. If you pay attention to EPA's regulatory agenda, they offer occasional updates. We had heard from the Hill that there might be movement towards a hazardous substance designation under CERCLA, which would open up some liability issues for public utilities potentially. So the most recent spring unified regulatory agenda from EPA said that they are indeed working on this. We still have not had enough information from the agency to assess or figure out exactly what this means and whether or not there would be a carve out for those of us that consider ourselves passive receivers. The last bullet on the slide is kind of our mantra, where we do not consider ourselves the manufacturers or putting these chemicals into the environment, and therefore we should not exclusively bear the burden of treatment costs and removal. So these are all issues that EPA is looking at. Just recently, there's been some movement on TSCA as well, and whether or not after the most recent 2016 amendments to TSCA would potentially allow for the agency to look at PFAS as one of the next suite of chemicals to have some sort of TSCA regulation. As you'll learn from the panel following this sort of introduction, there's a lot of movement on behalf of the states. I just listed a few here. There are a handful of states that are filling the regulatory gap absent federal action. So this might be on the drinking water side, but we're also seeing it spill over to the wastewater side, where they're requiring monitoring at both the influent and effluent areas, but they're also looking at residuals. So it's become challenging to both monitor this from the federal level, but also keep an eye on what states are doing. So just continuing to urge advocacy from the clean water side of things, need a unified voice that we do consider ourselves passive receivers, and definitely need help in addressing this issue. One other thing Andrew asked me to address is the lead and copper rule. This is something that EPA has been working on for a very long time. It's been over 20 years since they have had any revisions to the lead and copper rule. But in 2018, EPA started the process by seeking preliminary input of an approach that would look at lead and copper rule revisions. And so NACWA submitted some comments, and really our main concern was we really did not want to see a one-size-fits-all approach where you're using just a standardized corrosion control treatment technique. And that's sort of where the agency was leaning after Flint, Michigan. So they were leaning towards a standardized dosing of orthophosphate to mitigate lead entering drinking water. So we had some back and forth with the agency, and really we're urging the agency to have some flexibility because every state's different. The water quality factors are different. And one of the big concerns we had was specific to the arid West, where you usually have lower flows. And when you start adding more phosphorus in, you still have to remove that phosphorus, especially if you have Clean Water Act requirements to have certain discharge limits for phosphorus or nutrients. So we were worried about that dynamic. And here in a second, I'll just mention briefly kind of what's going on in Denver. The rulemaking proceeded. So in 2019, there was an actual proposed rulemaking. You can find this in the Federal Register. EPA didn't do anything with copper, specifically looking at lead. They did not touch the current action level of 15 parts per billion, but they did include a new trigger level of 10 parts per billion. And that sort of just jump starts regulatory actions if you hit this trigger level. Unfortunately, the orthophosphate showed up in the actual proposed rulemaking and is the preferred method for a corrosion controlled treatment. One of the tidbits in the proposed rule that we pushed back on a little bit was that EPA acknowledged that there will be additional costs to wastewater treatment, and they estimated this at $4.59 per pound of phosphorus. But they did not want utilities downstream of wastewater treatment plants to be able to raise these costs as a reason not to use orthophosphate. So there's a little bit of a push and pull happening between the orthophosphate issue and traditional flexibility with managing lead. And we're seeing that sort of play out. I expect to see the final rule come out sometime this year. I know it's a little chaotic with COVID-19. It's an election year. And EPA is working on a slew of federal regulations. So I think it will come out before the end of the calendar year, but you sort of never know. And then one thing I'll mention is there has been a unique approach happening in Denver, where Metro Wastewater Reclamation District, the wastewater utility, is working with the drinking water utility. They are separate, but they are collaborating. There's some environmental nonprofits that are also working to address the situation of the requirement for Colorado to dose the drinking water with orthophosphate, and how the wastewater utility is managing that as well. There's been some investment in removing lead service lines. There's also been some conversations on Clean Water Act variances. So there's a lot of really unique things happening in Denver that might be a protocol or a way forward for other utilities. And then just briefly, before I hand it over to my colleague, Kristina, these are some of the other issues we see that we are actively working on now. It is a lot. It has been a very busy year for us. Even with COVID-19, EPA is pushing forward with a lot of their regulatory initiatives. And one thing I did want to mention here is, I think here the third bullet I have on affordability, EPA just released about an hour or two ago their pre-publication notice of their updated affordability guidance. So this is their 2020 financial capability assessment. And I haven't had time to look at it, but it's the proposal to kind of get away from the reliance on 2% median household income as an affordability metric. So that's huge. NACWA's been working on this for over 20 years, and it would really help with some compliance schedules that are difficult to meet. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kristina to talk about congressional considerations.
Thanks, Emily. Can you hear me? Okay, I think I am. And thank you so much, Emily, for that kind of review of some of the core issues that we're tracking with EPA. And I just wanted to then spend a few minutes talking about kind of the interplay with what's happening at EPA, what's happening at Congress, how the pandemic plays into that in terms of funding and financing and potential new policy changes that are kind of on the horizon. So to take a step back, just wanted to say, you know, the kind of overarching theme of a lot of this year has been, in terms of Congress, has been ramped up congressional interest in issues of water affordability. You know, as anybody in this sector knows, the pandemic has really underscored the role of sanitation in protecting public health and the economy. And as a result of COVID, we have seen a lot of new attention to issues like low-income water assistance and maintaining strong core infrastructure in our country. We've also seen a lot of discussion, of course, a little bit more broadly than water, around the role of critical municipal services and the role of the federal government in helping, you know, help local governments keep their services strong. Now, for all of this interest, we have not seen any direct aid, of course, to date in pandemic relief packages for water. There has been some limited targeted assistance for municipal governments that can be used to help with direct COVID-related costs. And we've heard of, you know, number of drinking water and wastewater utilities that have explored ways to access some of that funding, in particular for providing some relief for low-income ratepayers that are now unable to pay their bills. And so there's been some ability by local to tap into a little bit of COVID relief, but no direct water aid. Now, shortly at the outset of the pandemic, NACWA did some estimates hearing from Congress concerns about how the pandemic would impact water and wastewater utilities. We did some projections estimating a 20% potential revenue loss to utilities from declining industrial and commercial demand over a year. That would be about $12.5 billion impact to the sector. We also estimated a potential $3.8 billion impact to the sector from increased inability to pay from local households that were facing, you know, job losses or, you know, increased financial hardship. The drinking water sector similarly did some estimates and came up with about a $13.8 billion estimate on the drinking water side of the house. Currently, NACWA is working with other organizations to update these numbers and sort of do a 6-month out projection of what the potential impact of the pandemic has been and forward. But of course, the story has really been local communities, local utilities, revisiting their projections, revisiting their budgets, making do in this current strained situation with really not any direct help from the federal government thus far. You know, but going outside of the COVID context, this increased concern and interest in investing more in water, has gone from the COVID conversations as well into more of kind of the so-called regular order actions that Congress needs to take. A couple areas where, we've seen this greater recognition of the need to invest in water and wastewater have been in the context of the annual funding bills, the appropriations bills, as well as the Water Resources Development Act conversation. That legislation is negotiated out every 2 years, and they're hoping to finish this current version up by the end of this year. Now, in both of those contexts, we've seen proposed significant plus-ups for state funds and for some of the core water programs, the grant programs that EPA offers. And of course, it's one thing to put those kind of higher proposed funding levels in a partisan bill or in a marker bill, but we've been encouraged to see success in seeing higher funding levels authorized on a bipartisan basis through the Water Resources Development Act and related proposals in both the House and the Senate. And so really kind to see just a little bit of kind of Congress putting kind of the money where the mouth is in terms of a greater need for investing in water infrastructure. The other, area where we've seen just a real shift in how the federal conversation has been going this past year, something that I know that has been talked about at this conference a lot in previous years, concept of establishing a federal low-income water ratepayer assistance program. That is something NACWA has supported in concept for many years and has been working to flesh out legislation on a pilot program basis on a bipartisan effort in the House and the Senate. If you wonder, well, why on a pilot basis? Because something like that is, of course, a huge lift to get enacted into law. Well, COVID has changed that. The House's most recent COVID relief package incorporated $1.5 billion in water ratepayer assistance, something that has never happened before passing the House. There is a lot of interest in it in the Senate as well, growing interest. And so that conversation has really shifted quite a bit. And while we don't anticipate that, anything yet being signed into law on that yet this year, that has really sort of informed and shaped how we might be able to push on this issue going into future years. And so I'm just going to wrap up by talking a little bit about the concerns regarding new cost utilities and potential unfunded mandates. And first and foremost with that is coming off of the COVID conversations, we've had a lot of increased talk at the federal level about should there be a moratorium on water shutoffs. That's something that we've seen a lot of local utilities, in fact, the majority of water and wastewater utilities, putting temporary moratoriums on water shutoffs in place at the local level. And we've seen that happen in a lot of states. That interest has also risen to Congress, and it's sort of become paired with the discussion around whether there would be federal assistance provided for water ratepayers. So that is something, the goal, of course, is shared by everyone of maintaining access for everybody for water. The idea of putting a federal moratorium on water shutoffs as a goal, towards maintaining access, well, that's really a Band-Aid and can create a lot, potentially more harm than good. If there's no assistance provided to help utilities in maintaining these services for people who cannot pay, of course, that's just an untenable situation. And so that's one area where we keep urging with Congress and have had really good conversations about pairing, the need that you cannot just, maintain access to water by saying you can't shut it off. And really, I think there's a lot more just kind of education and outreach to happen there. But that's definitely something that we are keeping an eye on. Secondly, something Emily talked a lot about, PFAS and potential regulatory changes under CERCLA or under the Clean Water Act, things that could create significant new costs for POTWs. As Emily mentioned, there's clearly a lot of need for action on PFAS and more work to be done through the regulatory process, but a need to be cognizant of the costs and, who bears those costs, should that be the public utilities, which didn't create or benefit from these chemicals. And then lastly, just wanted to flag another concept that's kind of another area that's gained a lot of interest including from Congress, which is wastewater-based surveillance for COVID-19. CDC and EPA working on has gained a lot of interest in Congress as well. We're just working to kind of help inform and help people work together on that, on this, and make sure that it doesn't lead to any new regulatory barriers or regulatory requirements down the road, or kind of inappropriately mire the role of wastewater treatment plants with public health agencies. So I'll stop there, and I'm not sure I have time for questions.
All right, thanks, Emily and Kristina. Appreciate it. Great presentation, and obviously, as as everybody can tell, you guys at NACWA kind of have your hands on a lot of different issues, regarding just what EPA is doing, as well as just all your members' challenges on a regular basis. So we did have a question come in. So Emily, I think maybe you could take this one, because this is kind of in reference to some things you were talking about. So with orthophosphate as the listed preferred treatment, how does that impact utilities' ability to take a replacement approach? And will they need approval from EPA to take that approach?
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on what the final rule says and when it becomes effective. What we're seeing in Colorado is there was a state mandate to do orthophosphate. And even though the wastewater utility pushed back on the nutrient issues that would create, they've been working collaboratively with their drinking water sisters and along with other stakeholders in the state to work this out. So I would say the simple answer is it depends, but also I think there are tools under the Clean Water Act that will help. Whether it's a variance, something that the federal government or EPA has been supportive of, states less so, but I think we're starting to see that tilt in a different direction. So there are some options, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Okay, another interesting question here. Given COVID testing is now happening on wastewater, and at, like, say, college campuses and elsewhere, you see a lot of testing. Do you see more widespread disease or vector testing for wastewater facilities in the future? Is that something that you could speak to?
Yeah, I'll go. Kristina, do you want me to? I'll go ahead and take this question real quickly. I know we're limited on time. This is wastewater-based epidemiology has been around for a long time. We've looked at polio before. There's been concerns over illegal drug use with opioids. This is just one more public health issue that demonstrates the great work that wastewater utilities do every day. But with respect to looking for COVID-19 RNA, this is a really good opportunity for utilities to help work in tandem with their public health agencies in the state. As Kristina mentioned, there's a lot of movement on CDC and EPA's part, Department of Homeland Security, HHS. All of these folks are dipping their fingers and toes into this space and trying to help provide a meaningful public health response path forward. So it is challenging, but yes, there is some concern that this could end up being some sort of regulatory creep where we no longer are sampling for fecal indicators perhaps, and just going straight to looking for viral pathogens in our wastewater treatment. So there's a unique play there. And as we're building the boat as we're floating in it. So it's a challenging issue that we're learning more and more about every single day.
One more question, Emily, and maybe you can take this one too, because I know we're having a little bit of difficulty with Kristina's audio. But final question, just to wrap things up a little bit, and maybe just kind of an obvious question given our kind of topic area today. As I mentioned, just everything that you guys went through, it kind of highlights all of the, not only utility challenges, but all of the different EPA priorities that are happening simultaneously. And, obviously in a year where we've had COVID and an election year and just so much going on, do you see, when you kind of look at all of these things, is this in fact a huge challenge for utilities to be able to find ways to pay for upgrades that might be in relation to some of these regulatory issues? Or, do they find a way to do it, or is it a pretty big challenge? How would you characterize that?
I think there is a big financial gap in what the federal government is handing down to utilities to deal with all of these regulatory compliance initiatives. And then to also look at, there's only one ratepayer, right? And they have to pay for drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. And all of these across all three are, the cost to comply are increasing. So the short answer is yes. We're constantly seeking more funding because investment in water is so important, and we always can use more. Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, we will go ahead and wrap this up and see everybody over for our panel discussion in just a minute. But Emily and Kristina, thanks very much for the presentation and for the updates on all of this. And if anybody has any other questions for Emily or Kristina, just continue to submit them here, and we will we'll make sure to have them and get these answered offline. All right, guys. Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Andrew.